Hello, I'm Kochi, a hobbyist environmental artist since around 2020. Currently, I'm working on a CS2 map called Vale, and this video will show my process for the modeling of a Renault 12 inspired vehicle for this map. From start to finish, including the modeling of the low poly and high poly, its texturing, the importation process, and then checking it out in-game. This will be the first of a series of videos behind the creation of assets and arting of a CS2 map. Since sometimes I won't have much to say and the creation of this video with its commentary was already quite a bit of work, I'll mostly stick to posting regular time lapses without comments. The whole process for this car took me around 40 hours, so I sped it up by 60 times so it's easier to digest. Please let me know if it's too fast or too slow. So now into what matters. I started by opening the Vale map file inside the source2 editor, which has the car shape blocked out in the grey box version of my level. I exported a blockout shape as an FBX and imported it into Blender to have a sense of scale I should follow. Usually real-life scales are distorted in games for the sake of better gameplay, and CS2 being a competitive game really needs to nail down scale. I then searched for the blueprints of my inspiration, the Renault 12. I picked the highest resolution pictures I could find that seemed to line up between each other. If they were at lower resolutions, they'd be too blurry and make it more difficult to work around smaller details. With that, I rescaled the blueprints to fit around the size of the blockout I imported, and I started modeling. At this point, I think it's worth mentioning that this is the first car I ever worked on, so the process I'm using might not be the best, as I followed a few things I've seen over the years, but nothing exact. As you can see, I began by doing the hood and frontal part of the car, by tracing the silhouettes, edges, or defining lines of the vehicle. For that, I extruded lines of vertices that I could then fill the space in the middle with reasonable topology. My workflow for models tends to always start with the low poly model first, which I feel gives me the most control on how much detail I can put on each area and know exactly how it will look in game. For this car it wasn't any different, so what you see here is the low poly which will be used in game. As I did it, I also were marking the sharp edges, the blue edges you can see, that controlled how the model would be shaded. While shaping the front part of the body, I realized I didn't know how I would do the lights of the car, which made me look into existing CS2 cars to see how they were done. Having references of how a certain type of model, such as a car, is modeled and textured, really helps in these moments of doubt. So after looking around a bit, I figured I had to model the actual cavity of each light and then put a translucent glass plane in front of it, just like in real life, so no big deal. I proceeded by then doing the grille and bumper on the front. This is the point where I took some small liberty and I modeled it slightly different than the real car, as if my final map is to ever be featured in game, there will be no licensing or copyright problems. This difference is just a grille, where I've simplified it slightly and changed the logo to one I came up at the time. Nothing much. So far, everything I'm modeling is being mirrored, which saves me a lot of time and guarantees each side is the same. But that's also important because later on, I can control which parts of the car I want to have mirrored or not, as this car is not perfectly symmetrical everywhere. There's also texturing to take into account, as if the wrong parts are mirrored, it becomes obvious in the texture scenes, but I also can't have everything to be textured uniquely, as I'll either have to increase the texture resolution, which increases file size, or it will have to have a lower texel density than the standards of CS2, which would make the final product look blurrier or more pixelated than the rest of the map or even existing levels in the game. So after doing the front, I followed through to the roof and its pillars. This area took me a bit more work to get right, as it does seem quite simple at first, but its slight roundness makes it harder to get a simple mesh density that also looks good enough. What really helped me here was a simple tip some friends teach me, which is checking how the silhouette or extremities of your mesh looks, especially against a background, from the angles your model will be seen from. If you spot any hard transitions or blockedness doing that, it's then fine to add more geometry to make it smooth until it's hard to notice. Of course, the type of model you're working on can change how much detail you'll need. If it's gonna be seen from afar and has less importance, like some small cables, there's less need to round out these hard transitions and edges. But for this car, since it will be completely unplayable space and a defining prop for the map, what we call a hero prop, there's freedom to have a detailed mesh. With hindsight now, I would have spent a bit more time applying the tip I just mentioned, as I didn't look around enough at the end to make sure the level of detail was enough from all angles, as the final product has some visible blockness in some specific angles. Most of them aren't that noticeable or important, but there's a big one I noticed in the front of the car in the hood area as soon as I did the renders to share my work. But I don't care enough at this point to go back and fix it though, as there's a lot more work to be done on the rest of the project. One of the really important things I've learned over these years doing environmental artwork is that often you must sacrifice perfection so you can actually complete projects in reasonable time frames. So this problem just serves as a good lesson for the next times. And this lesson could be summed up into: when all shapes of your model are done, do an extensive final check on the silhouettes and smoothing of your geometry when it's working with vehicles or similar props. This final check also is a good reason to have good topology, as although I did let some flaws go unnoticed, I still did a checkup at the end which had me increasing the amount of faces used in specific places. For that, I did many loop cuts and small adjustments, which were quite fast to make. If the topology had problems though, this simple task would have taken way longer. I then continued to shape the body up, as you can see, falling to the doors and back of the car. One annoying thing that happened across all of this is that one of the blueprints used as a background didn't line up with the rest of them. I think it was the top one. It did give me a bit more work overall, as I had to average the blueprints out myself, and sometimes I had to scale or move them, but nothing major. It is valuable to mention I've been using many other reference images on my second monitor while model, especially further on as I can't figure some details just from the blueprints. In some moments where I stop modeling, I'm likely looking for or at them. I could say I have become way too reliant on copying references one-to-one over time, but having many inspirations and images from multiple angles really helps the creative work process nonetheless. Using a lot of references really did improve my work drastically. For CS2 being a game focused on the recreation of current-day realistic environment layouts and proportions, this over-reliance on copying references might not matter, but I'm certain it can be a problem for any future projects that do not have accessible references or follow a different style than CS. I don't think this undervalues the power of references in any way, but it shows me that I must develop the ability to mix different sort of inspirations to create my own unique ideas and solutions. This is also valuable to any other artist as well. Now here you can see me struggling to get proper topology for this fuel cap. I definitely spent way too much time on it. After working further on this model, I did look at some cars made by better artists, and I realized a thing that should have been pretty obvious. This is that if you're going to put any holes or cavity-like details in a round shape, often done in cars, you can first model the shape without the detail, as if it were just a flat part with its regular roundness, and then you add the shape that subtracts into this part. With that, you can then make sure all the vertices on the extremities of the subtraction, the parts which come in contact with the existing base shape, are on the same plane as it. You can then delete the base faces that intersect with the subtraction and fill them with triangles or whatever topology is most appropriate. I ended up having a lot of trouble with smoothing on this fuel cap because the extremities of it, the circle, didn't quite line up with the faces of the base geometry of that part. Another thing I figured from looking at other car models was that you can definitely use a lot of triangles if your mesh does need it. I did initially avoid them when working at this car, but it soon became obvious that these type of models really need triangles if it's to have a proper smooth look without visible polygon transitions or blockness. Triangles were a must on this car to make sure parts like the fenders, windshield, windows and subtractions such as the fuel cap looked good and with enough geometry. A lot of them were added at the final steps once I was checking the silhouettes and the extremities with more attention. I kept working and I had the main shape of the car done, so I started doing some of the other details, such as light, bumper parts and car plate. I had way more freedom with their geometry as they could easily be placed as separate objects on the existing body. For the car plate I imported an Argentinian car plate as reference into Blender, as I wanted it to be the same as real life, since my level is set in Argentina. Once I modeled it, I used an array modifier with an empty object as reference, so I could place the second plate in front without having to model another one manually. also allowing them to share the same UV space. This saves some small texture space without considerable downsides, as they're on opposite sides of the car. With a few of the details modeled, I started closing in the gaps around the lower part of the vehicle. After a bit, I had no idea on how to proceed, so I went to look again on existing car models, specifically the CS2 ones. I took the opportunity and I also exported the wheels from an existing CS2 model, so I could import them into Blender to have a notion of the dimensions and level of detail, making my job easier when working on my own wheels. After that, I also spent some time looking for references of the bottom of the car, but they were very scarce. One funny thing about this project is that together with it being my first car model, I also have barely any technical knowledge about cars. This made the bottom part of the car a scary part to work on, so I ended up leaving it for later, maybe allowing me to better understand how all those parts of the under part of the car worked until I eventually got to it. This is one of the interesting parts of being an artist, as if you want to make the highest quality art of something set in earth, even if stylized, you really need to go deeper and learn specific details of disciplines often quite far from art. The current example is understanding how a car works, so you can properly execute its bottom, suspension, and other parts. But the more time I do art, the more I have to learn other things too, such as architectural norms, weathering by the sun, acid rain, concrete pouring, water surface tension, and many other random things. All of them allow me to have a better understanding of the world and why it's the way it is, helping my craft. So back to the car, I ended up polishing the body and closing the remaining gaps by working on the windshield and windows. Something I started using only now, which I forgot until this point and would have been really helpful before, are matte caps. Blender has some default ones that are way shinier than the default flat gray look and are perfect for round shapes such as those found in a car. They allow me to easily spot any imperfections in shading, making sure they don't go unnoticed. While closing these remaining gaps, I also took the opportunity to add more geometry to places where I saw any blockness when inspecting my model. Those were on the round upper sides of the body, the roof, windshield frames, and on the trunk. I only adjusted some of those because I shared screenshots of my work with other people when I had progress to show. Because of that, they gave me some very useful feedback on my work. These people are my friends, which often aren't ideal as feedback givers, as they will always be biased towards you in the way they won't tell or even see any of the flaws that do exist in your work. However, I've also worked with a few of them in the past, and many also work on similar type of projects, so they are experienced and know the importance of honest feedback. Having more sets of eyes, other than your own, to look at your work is impactful. They will often see things you would never see, which with hindsight are obvious flaws sometimes. They can also confirm any suspicions of yours, which you might have not considered to be that important. But even with honest feedback, sometimes you must filter some of it, as not always you can agree to it or please everyone. Filtering feedback is a very important skill, as there is a right balance that will yield you to the best results for your vision, time, and end product. For this car, the feedback was pretty easy to filter, as a model tends to be more objective than a whole video game level. What was pointed out was simply some weirdness to the body shapes here and there, which led me to do the tweaks mentioned. You can see I did spend a bunch of time doing these tweaks. From it being my first car ever, I did do a few mistakes earlier, which led me to have more work here. However, I learned from them and I fixed them nonetheless. I then followed to the wheels, using the imported CS2 ones as reference, as I mentioned before. They were quite fast to make and I was satisfied from the first iteration. I then used an array and mirror to have the same single wheel be placed on the remaining parts of the car, saving on texture space. One detail on this part that isn't modeled on the low poly are the tire treads and inscriptions. If they were actually part of the geometry, the mesh complexity would be too high. That's where texturing makes a lot of difference. With the high poly version of the same wheel, I'm able to model and bake down these details inside Substance Painter, which I did. Unfortunately though, I ended up forgetting to record myself modeling the high poly of the tire treads, which was done later on together with the rest of the high poly of the car. However, the process for making it was quite simple, as I just picked an image from the surface of a tire tread I liked, then modeled a single row of the treads with simple planes on a separate object. I then added thickness to it and arrayed it enough times so when I applied the curved modifier with a weld, it closed up the loop of the tire just right. I also added small details on the side, such as some writing for a fake tire company, then some lines, which are just simple ring-shaped extrudes. As it's not the model to be textured nor used in-game, just being the high poly, you can have way more freedom when working with mesh, so it's quite fun. After the wheel, I went back to tweaking and improving the car body, as I still saw some flaws. Some shading issues were really annoying to fix, making me spend a lot of time just on them. I for sure haven't had enough trouble with this in the past to know all the tips and tricks to fixing these issues. One of them was especially troublesome was the back pillar part of the body, on its side. While spending a bunch of time on it without much visual improvement, I then realized I could model the vent that is present on the same place. I then made it, which was fast, in hopes it would cover some of the shading issue or at least make it less noticeable. I think it helped a bit, but it made me realize it was about time for me to start working on the remaining parts of the car. I could always fix the shading later or even ignore it in the end, which I did end up doing, showing to not be as noticeable of a problem as I initially thought. With that, I started working on the other details of the car, which were the last things left before I had to go to the bottom part. I did a bumper detail, then I started to make this tank or pipe sort of thing at the side of the back plate of the vehicle. This is where my limited knowledge of cars came to bite me. I only realized this mistake while editing this video, which ended up being quite funny at the time I found out. This mistake is that this pipe-like detail on the side of the back plate is the fuel cap and connection to the tank. But then you ask, didn't you also model another fuel cap on the side? And yes, I did. And because of that, my final car has two fuel tanks, or entrances, or caps, or whatever you call it. I really thought that backplate part was some sort of maintenance liquid container or whatever, as I never saw any car having a fuel cap in the back, just on the sides. That's why I didn't think much when making it. Only later doing this video I realized my mistake, and the cause was simple. I used different production year references of the same car to make my own. Some models had the fuel cap on the sides, but no detail on the backplate part, but others were the opposite. In no point in time did I ever see this difference. At this stage, I think it's quite funny of a mistake, and it would have been also too much work that I can't be bothered to do for a small fix. So I'll leave it as it is. Please don't tell anyone. Other than this additional fuel tank, I'm sure I didn't make any other big mistakes on the following details. At least I hope that is the case. These other details were first the light bulbs and bumper rivets, done by tweaking some low poly cylinders. I followed then to the mirrors, windshield wipers and door handles. The mirrors weren't exactly a challenge, but they did take me a bit of time to get the round shapes right with a proper level of geometry. Fortunately though, they were present on the blueprints of the car and just needed one side to be made. You can see that the cylindrical connection between the base and mirror doesn't use much geometry, but if you do look around from regular angles at the final product, it's not really noticeable. When working on it, I followed the tip I explained earlier regarding checking your mesh against its backgrounds. That's what made me stick to the lower poly connection. Doing that, I figured the only angle you could see such blockness was against the mirror itself, so I just beveled the edges on the first ring of the cylinder that touched the mirror. After the mirror, I also missed a bit of the recording on the beginning of the wipers, but nothing much. The wipers were annoying to make, as each one of them had to be different to suit the angles of the windshield. Their cavities and general shape were also time consuming to work with. To be fair though, I wasn't efficient with their approach. I modeled them trying to fit the windshield from the start, which made many misalignments between upper and lower bars due to the roundness. If they were made out to be fully straight, then deformed when completed to fit the window, it would have been way easier. For the second wiper, I first had to mark seams on the first one, as I wouldn't be able to array it due to them needing to be different. That would save some time as I had to straight up copy it, to then do the deformations on the second one to fit the windshield. One problem on their final shape came from the fact I did them without looking at existing models. When looking at them later, I figured mine lacked a bit of detail, but nothing big enough to worry about. After this, from spending too much time looking at the car body, it became jarring to me that the fenders were so blocky around the wheel space, so I went on a side tangent to bevel them for it to look good. With that, I also spent some time fixing the shading that came with the new geometry. Once done, I went back to the details, this time now the door handles. They were on the blueprints, but with such a complex shape they weren't enough. Due to that, I looked a bit for some close-up references. The rest of the work then was quite fun and easy. I also just needed to model a single handle, as I could mirror and array the rest. By now there isn't much left to the low poly, finishing the door handles and arraying them to their positions. I did a few other adjustments and then the exhaust, which would lead me to complete the body of the car by making its bottom. I again looked at the few existing cars inside the Source 2 editor to see the level of detail I should have in this part. Overall I could have way less detail on the underparts, but I chose to have even less than the models I looked at, as I didn't want to take much more time on this model. Due to that, I did some very flat cover on the bottom, with just some lips at the edges. Other than the flat covering and exhaust, the only real modeled thing is the suspension, which I was able to make from references of the real car's rear suspension. The suspension is mirrored both on its own axis but also the central line of the car, so it saves a lot of texture space. I then arrayed it, with both front and rear wheels using the same type of suspension, which I think isn't right looking at the real car, but I don't care at this point. Afterwards I tweaked the bottom cover, adding a central block to support the suspension, which I bet is also quite inaccurate, but it did make it slightly more interesting. In the end, it won't be seen that much, that's why I'm not putting much effort into guaranteeing its realism. It's even funnier now that you consider the car has also 2 fuel tanks. By now the low poly is basically done, so I just did a few more tweaks so I could then start unwrapping the model. Due to the place this vehicle will be in the final map, players can stand all around it, which is the reason I didn't make an interior for it. If the windows were translucent so you could see from one part of the car to the other, the gameplay of my level would have been affected, worsening the whole experience. So since my windows needed to be opaque to avoid this issue, there would be no reason to model any of the interior, as it wouldn't even be seen. This also led me to choose to texture my vehicle with a more worn look, so I had an excuse to have opaque glass, justifying it to be dirty. To begin texturing, I looked at CS2 cars again, to have an idea of how many materials were used, and I decided early to just have 2. I would split these 2 materials into one at 2K resolution, just for the glass parts and headlights, while the other at 4K would be the rest of the car. Again, more materials mean more file size and draw costs, which should be lower if possible. By looking at the car scale, I could tell by eye I would need a 4K texture, mostly because of the surface area of the car body. At these resolutions I would stay around the game's standard texel density. With that in mind, it's just then a manual process of marking seams at the edges, shown in red, and unwrapping parts of the whole car repeatedly so I can spot any issues. This whole process took me a bit, but it still had some important things to consider in the middle. Again, because of the big surface area of a car, you have to be smart about your texture usage, even at 4K. But like I said before, you also have to be careful with the mirror seams that can be spotted from miles away. Important things done here to guarantee a good texture usage were on the mirrors. The modifier is used though, not the actual mirrors of the car. So regarding these mirrors, I first separated the mesh of the car body and other big centered parts into different objects. The parts of these meshes I selected to separate were the center parts on the mirror line, so the hood, roof, trunk, front and rear bumpers. With that, I could then apply the mirrors, making so when I unwrap them, they would not have the mirror seam in the middle. It's important to cite I didn't do this with the bottom of the car, although it's similar to these other parts. That was done since it would have been seen that much, so I don't care much about the mirror seam there. Remember, anything that stays mirrored saves valuable texture space. With the mirror applied to these parts, I could then do some small tweaks since although I modeled these sections with a mirror, not all of them are perfectly symmetrical. One example I changed was the exhaust cavity, together with the second wrong fuel tank on the rear bumper, as both are present on just one side. Now one good tip regarding how to know which parts can be mirrored instead of the ones that can't is looking at the opposites of a car. If 2 parts of the car are separated and mostly seen from opposite angles, that means you won't really be able to see both of these parts at the same time. This shows that you can freely mirror these parts if they're identical, which again saves a lot of texture space. One good example are the sides of the car, which are opposites and also quite big in surface area. Other than that, I believe nothing else really was done with the mirrors regarding texturing. The final key thing to say is that the whole bottom plane of part of the car was scaled down by 1/3 in the UV map. This part is quite big in surface area, but as I explained before, due to the static nature of the prop, it won't be seen that much. This allows me to reduce its texel density, opening room for the rest of the car to have it even higher. With the first unwrap done then, I imported it into Substance Painter so I could try texturing it, as I was dying to see how it would look. I'm not that experienced with Substance Painter, so this also helped me to warm up and have a better idea for how I would proceed to texture my car when I actually had my high poly made. After messing around a bit, I was able to spot some minor issues and things missing, which I corrected before and while doing the high poly. These were minor visual issues and unwrapping problems, together with the fact I also forgot to model the car brand and model letters on the back of the car. By now the only things left to do are the high poly, texturing, making the collisions, then importing it in-game. The high poly is quite easy here as there's nothing to sculpt, it just takes me some repetitive work. For the high poly I simply copied all existing objects, putting them on a different collection in Blender. I renamed every object with the low and high suffixes, so I'm able to bake each object only against itself inside Substance Painter, which looks best in Source 2 while saving me some time. Having the low poly objects copied and named with their respective high suffixes for Painter, I'm then able to work on the geometry adding details, polish, and complexity that otherwise wouldn't be able to be modeled and included in the mesh used in-game. Most of those are done with just some modifiers and tweaks to the geometry. The ones I usually use are bevels and subdivision, which often go hand in hand with each other. In some specific scenarios I do actually need to spend more time modeling different shapes from the low poly which aren't achieved with just modifiers. Examples are the bumps on the suspension, the vents between the hood and windshield, and as mentioned, the tie treads, which I didn't record on video. The car body had to have more thought be put into it, as the low poly didn't include the crevices between each body part. These are the divisions between the doors, hood, trunk, and other pieces of the body. Other than that, I also had to achieve a similar shading to the real reference car with the high poly subdivision. For that, I couldn't really use the hard edges that set clear stops to the smooth shading. In real life, even a hard transition has some smoothness to it, so that's why I had to work around the edges marked sharp. Both of these things made me take more time with the car body, but it still was pretty chill to work on it. The approach to solve this was to select the edges I marked as sharp on the low poly, then put a bevel weight into them, so I could then apply a bevel modifier using the set weights. I hadn't actually planned to do this from the beginning of my work in the low poly, but thankfully I still did the topology of it thinking it was important to have edges flowing right on top of the divisions of the body. This made so after setting bevel weights to the sharp edges, I could also set more bevel weights to the parts which weren't marked sharp. These parts were the divisions of the doors, hood, and so on as I mentioned. With all of that set, I then applied a bevel modifier at 3 divisions, allowing me to extrude the middle row in the parts I needed to have the divisions on. After that, I could simply slap a subdivision modifier and it would smooth out the blockness of these extrudes, while also making a smooth but also sharp transitions on the hard transitions of the body. One good example of these transitions is the horizontal ornamental line on the middle of the sides of the car. One of the final parts recorded of my work on the high poly was my first attempt at doing the tire treads. This attempt was unsuccessful and led me to search for better ways to make it. Then after learning a better way, my second attempt did work, but it also was the one I forgot to record on video, as I said beforehand. At this point, other than the things already said, the rest of the high poly was just regular work, allowing me to proceed to the texturing phase inside Substance Painter. To make sure everything was right before texturing, I did a few high poly bakes inside Substance, going back and forth from Painter to Blender, tweaking and fixing the final things. It was here that I added the final detail of the car brand and name letters at the rear part of the vehicle. My friends unfortunately didn't give me any good meme ideas to name my car, so I spent too much time thinking of names that sounded good and worked as references to anything. In the end I named the car company after my nickname, which is lame, but I then named the model after the most important playtesters of my map's layout. At first, I wanted to have the car brand to be Alpine, a reference to the map of same name which placed second on the Mapcore Big Adventures contest. When seeking for suggestions of names with my brother though, he mentioned Alpine was a sports car division of Renault, which is also the brand of car I used as reference to make mine. This made me abandon the Alpine name, as I didn't want to have connections to any real brand. I had to then unwrap these letters, which was a bit annoying, but being so small, there was free space for them to fit the existing UV map of the rest of the car. Now it was time to really start texturing. To ensure best quality, I used the best baking settings, making so the bake took a bit more time. Once the bake was done and I didn't notice anything worrying, I started texturing. Once again, for this stage I also looked for many references of worn cars, most of this specific model of car I'm basing mine off. Initially, I preferred to just apply all materials I think fit best, trying to cover the whole car. Once that is done, you could say your car texture is complete, but that's not true. If you go look at this stage, the flaws are many, but they're not so in your face. These type of flaws are what differentiates decent textures to great textures, and also art in general. They're things that if done right, no one usually notices, but if they're wrong, something feels off. They're details that give life to your art, that make it make sense, that tells stories. I'll be explaining some of these details as I develop the car's texture, but I think most of them are easier to be focused on when you already have the base of your texture done. By this stage, the base texturing of the vehicle is almost there. The final things done before I started focusing on the details is texturing the grille and vents with a grid pattern. Once done, it's then time for the details. Again, they might be simple, but they make all the difference. I first started with the dirt on the tires and other parts of the car. For that, I considered the context of my map, where it's set. My map is set on a medium-sized town, in the countryside you could say. It's set in Argentina, a big country with lots of driving. The place has a specific soil color, which can be dry in specific seasons of the year, but also there's many bodies of water around. This, together with the worn direction I had to follow with the texture, made me decide on a story for this car, its personality. It would be one of those cars used for decades, but also for continuous driving. It could be from someone with a secluded farm, a bit far from downtown. Because of that, the way I did the dirt on the car reflects that. The dirt on the tires indicated going through dirt roads at the soil color of the region. But then as you go up in the car, mud being heavier, you see less of those bigger wetter blobs of dirt. You start to see more of a dry dirt from the more common dry trails this car could have went through. This is just one of the examples of doing these details right. It's a minor thing in the overall picture, but by having a story, by making sense, it's so much more powerful. Here's a good reason on why I spend time making a detailed tire high poly, as it makes this sort of texturing way easier and better. After the dirt, I apply the same principles and background story for the rest of these details, following them now when I'm tweaking the rust. The original material that does come with the rust spreads it around evenly throughout the body. But in real life, usually you might think these things are random, but most of the time there's a reason behind every phenomenon. And this is no different than the rust, so I started reducing the frequency it happened in the car, together with reducing the wobbliness of the paint itself. This is important because it serves as visual rest, and makes sure there's no wear on places that wouldn't have much wear. But it also emphasizes the parts that I do make to be more worn later, as there is more contrast between clean and worn parts, instead of having an homogenic wear level everywhere. If it is the same everywhere, together with not making sense, it is also less interesting, as visual interest is often created by patterns, contrast, using the whole spectrum from 0 to 1. Considering that, the parts that I then applied most rust to were based mostly on the references, so among cavities, like the crevices between doors. Whatever place that would have more contact with water and its accumulation were good places to put rust in. From the rust, again using the same principles, I went to the paint. Paint usually loses coloration from sunlight exposure, so that's where the curvature maps come in hand. The brighter spots of a curvature is at the pointy bits, the outer extremities. This is helpful, as it will also be where the car gets more exposure to sunlight. Considering that, again, I reduce the occurrence of the default random distribution of wear, this time the discolored paint from the base paint material. With that, when I added the discolored paint using principles that made sense, such as sunlight exposure instead of pure randomness, they were emphasized. The last of these more interesting and powerful details, and perhaps the most fun to do, was the dust and dirt placed on the windows. It's another detail which tells the story of this car, being that it was left still in the same place where it is on the level for some time. Enough time for dust, wear and pollution to accumulate. It then makes you wonder why it was left there. Maybe the owner died alone, the car being of his ownership for decades, not being passed on to anyone else. It leaves a lot of questions if you do bother to look at it and ask him. But it also serves as a tool for anyone passing by to leave their message. The classic finger writings on dust. Now it was time to fill the glass with references and Easter eggs, justifying them to be markings left by random people. I put some friends' names and then other things, like a tic-tac-toe game, a wash me with a sad face on the side, and so on. The phrases were in Spanish though, considering it's in Argentina. This is one situation where mirroring the opposite sides was a problem though. Due to the door windows being mirrored, I couldn't put any writing on them, as they would be shown on the other side too, but well, mirrored. It would be noticeable instantly. Their orientation is also considering the radius of range of the arm of who's writing such message. That means the text has some roundness to it depending on the situation. The ones in the middle, being harder to reach, also have some further distortion. The ones in the middle, being harder to reach, also have some further distortion, meaning the person had trouble keeping a steady hand at such distance. All of this combined again to have a texture that makes sense, is interesting visually, and tells a story. After the windows, it was then time to finish texturing, by making the identification plate. My Substance Painter is the paid version from 2021, so unfortunately I was limited to the default fonts. This made me import a mask done with a different font on an external vector software, on this case Inkscape. One mistake done here, which I fixed off camera later, was not checking if the car plate I used existed or not. I remembered to check it only later, and for my luck it was an existing plate used in Argentina. This led me to rework it later, after getting a combination that wasn't used by any vehicle. Once the plate was done, it was then time to import the textures, model and collisions to the source to editor. I use Substance Designer for small tweaks on the final textures. It also leaves space for any future adjustments I might do. For the collisions I simply had to export different sets of low poly objects for each type of material. Now here we are in game, let's check our final car. Yeah, the windows will definitely need some work. Their material doesn't look right. The reflections. Can always tweak it later. The collisions seem right. I'm pretty satisfied with how it turned out for my first car. Of course I can spot a flaw here and there and might not look that great right now, but once the art around it is all done, it's easier to tell which part exactly needs to be worked on. It's also on the shadow right now, the cube maps around it aren't built properly, so it's not on the most optimal context. But that's it for this video. I hope you liked it. Please leave your thoughts and tell me if you want to see more of these. And have a good day.